Good morning, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us on our first webinar for South Asia, talking about corn and corn co-products. We will be speaking today, or we'll be hearing today from our Manager for Global Trade from the U.S. Grains Council, Reese Kennedy, as well as a couple of special hosts from our member companies, Poet. We will be hearing from them on DDGS and PS&D for DDGS and nutrition. We are very excited to welcome you all. Please, just a few reminders as we get started. All of your phones have been muted at this point. If you have any questions, we urge you to write them down in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as we're going through the presentations. But also we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So I also encourage you to take note and participate during the live Q&A session. Today we have on the phone participants from all the 5 countries representing South Asia. So we have participants from India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan. And we're very, very excited to have you hear from us and hope to hear your questions. And we hope that this is a beneficial program for you. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Reese for his presentation on the corn PS&D.
Can we enable screen sharing? Because I cannot share my screen.
Okay.
Try it now, Reese.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reese Kennedy. I'm the Manager of Global Trade at the U.S. Grains Council. Like Alejandra said, I appreciate the introduction, Ale. I'm here to talk to you about our corn market outlook for the next year. We're going to talk about exactly what's going on in the world of corn. You're looking at huge global stocks and U.S. stocks. I just want to talk to you a bit about them going forward. So quickly, I wanted to highlight something. When we look at regional corn imports around the world, obviously South Asia here in blue looks like we're seeing some sort of an increase, certainly in corn imports into the region. So it's an upward trend, and it's something that we're looking at. When we look at global corn production, we've got ahead of us, so this is going to be the projections for next year. This is this past year. We've got record world production around corn, and a lot of that is going to be driven by U.S. production, as well as record crops in South America, as well as Ukraine. But U.S. certainly leading the charge. And then when we look at ending stocks, I'll come back and touch on this in a bit, but our global ending stocks really are not projected to be that out of the question. We've had larger ending stocks before in 2016 and even in 2017. But one thing I do want to point out is the U.S. stocks. So this is the U.S. number down here at 84 million tons that we're projected to carry over into the next year as of today. I'll talk about why it may not be that high, but even still, we're projected to have a very large carryout there in the U.S., which means that even though globally there may have been more corn in the past, the U.S. origin, I think, is positioned to be one of the world's cheapest over the next marketing year. Look at our largest corn producers. Just for those of you that maybe haven't looked at this data before, the U.S. is definitely the number 1 corn producer in the world by a long shot, with China coming in at second. But keep in mind, China does not export. They're a net importer of feed grains and coarse grains. So, this 260 number really, while it can put a dent in the Chinese consumption, never hits the global market. So when we look at global markets, we really want to look at the U.S., we want to look at Brazil, and then we want to look at Argentina and Ukraine/Black Sea. So again, huge production around the world. We're seeing very large production anticipated in Brazil at a record crop, coming in at just over 100 million tons. The U.S. crop projected to be about 4 times as large at 406 million tons. And then we have Argentina, who has kind of steadily been producing 50 million tons over the past few years. And then the Ukraine is projected to have another record crop, which is, continues to add to the global balance sheet. And I think logistically provides an advantage to many countries strictly because of where Ukraine is on a map. Having that extra 35 to 40 million tons of production every year has certainly lent itself to stiffer competition in the Mediterranean Sea region as well as the Middle East. One thing I do want to point out is these numbers here in Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, we're seeing them grow ever so slightly, and we don't anticipate that to stop. That will likely continue into the next years. And the big reason there is going to be because of currency devaluation. So when you're coming out of Brazil and Argentina and Ukraine, a lot of that stuff is contracted in dollars when sales are made, and the farmer gets paid in local currencies. So the local currency has devalued in all 3 of these places significantly when you compare it to the dollar. And so when people are receiving more Brazilian reals, more Argentinian pesos, more Ukrainian hryvnia for the same amount of grain, obviously there's more money in their pockets. They have more local spending power than they had before. So people are, farmers are, and producers are doing very well in South America and in Ukraine right now. So due to the devaluation against the dollar. So we definitely anticipate further incentives to plant corn and soybeans over the next years, specifically with corn acres probably increasing more than any other. So we do anticipate increased crop sizes around the world as we move forward. With the U.S., this may be a bit of a black swan year as far as our production. As you can see, we were going down steadily year over year, but market conditions have put us projected to be back up in the 400 million ton range, which is far and away a record crop year. So looking at global production and some export policy, just some things that are going on. North America, so here in our neck of the woods, we're in planting, and I'll show you some updates on planting, et cetera. We've got a lot of good weather. There's a lot of things that probably suggest we'll have a very, very good crop. We'll talk about that again in a minute. And then South America, you've got Argentinian corn exports that are 52% lower as of the other day. So, we're 28% behind, or sorry, 52% lower year over year, and then 28% behind the 5-year average. So the big thing there is you have low water volumes that have caused some logistical issues there at the ports in Argentina. But just really quickly, that will probably change. The water issues have been resolved to an extent. Things I think are looking a bit more normal in Argentina. And right now, as far as sales into many regions, I think Argentina is dominating the global market. When you look at the Med Sea region, they're about $8 to $10 per metric ton discount into the Med Sea region. So they are significantly cheaper than U.S. corn today. So even though they are behind on their exports, keep in mind, as far as pricing goes today, they are the cheapest origin due to harvest pressure. That should change here very quickly. This happens every year. This is seasonal conditions. For those of you that are buyers out there, you're very aware of this. Then you look at Brazil. As I mentioned earlier, record corn crop around the corner. A lot of people have done quite a bit of contracting on that. So again, it's going to be like any other year. Brazil will come in and sell their crop as quickly as they can. And when they sell that crop, they'll run out of offers. And again, it's something we see every year when the safrinha crop comes off, or the big crop. Safrinha crop has just been the big crop over these past few years. Black Sea, Ukraine has already put on quite a few sales, some to China, taking up some of their tariff rate quota. But definitely the Med Sea region is, for the quantity that they're able to export, is certainly home for Black Sea corn. And then regarding China, I know there's a lot of questions about China. China is just a huge player in the soybean market, and also the distillers grains market if they're around, and the wheat and the global wheat market as well. But when it comes to corn, there's a tariff rate quota. I want to sort of minimize China's importance in the corn market. Now, are they important? Absolutely. They have roughly 4 million tons on the books with the U.S. between this year and the next marketing year. So, they're very important, But when you're capped at 7.2 million tons per year of corn imports globally, it really limits the amount of manipulation you can put on the market. So I do want to be very clear that while China is an important partner of ours this year for corn, just because of the tariff rate quota they have, and if anyone has a question on that, I can explain it. It makes them less susceptible to being able to control things like they can in some other major markets, particularly oilseeds. Looking at corn plantings here in the U.S., this is as of May 31st. The data came out last night. We're 93% done compared to a 5-year average of 89%, but then compared to last year's average of 64%. So for those of you that may have seen the corn quality reports and are familiar with some of the growing conditions we had last year, this is definitely very welcome news, particularly seeing North Dakota get bumped up. North Dakota was at 20% planted 2 weeks ago, and now got some dry weather, and folks really got in the field very quickly. So farmers remember last year's planting conditions, and we were very behind last year at 64%. So they wanted to make sure they were ahead of the curve this year so we could have a good start to the growing season. When we look at corn emerged, again, we're ahead of schedule on planting, so we should be ahead of schedule on emergence as well, and that is the case. So it's 78% versus a 5-year average of 73%, and then well above last year at 42%. Looking at corn in good to excellent condition, I don't compare this to years past, but last week we were at 70%, which is, I know it sounds really, really great, but it's kind of in the ballpark of average. It sounds great when we compare it to last year. At the same time, we were in the 50s. So to see it bump back up to something that I would consider normal or regular is good. And then also to see week over week an increase from 70% to 74%, I think is just a really good indication of a fairly strong growing season to come. So as long as we don't have any weather interruptions, we should see some pretty good yields. I'll go over the balance sheet here in a moment, but that should be what we're positioning ourselves for going forward. So looking at the balance sheet, I've converted everything into hectares and metric tons. So when we look at this yield, so I want to start there. This is 11.2 metric tons per hectare. That's a trend line yield. So that yield has no scientific data behind it. It is a yield that simply is based upon tendencies in plant breeding innovation and seed technology that we have here in the U.S., just understanding the trends that we're consistently going up. So, this is projected to be a very high yield. It really is going to be predicated on weather. But again, when we look at things like good to excellent condition improving, as well as being well ahead on emergence and planting, we're really positioning ourselves to have a fairly strong yield. And if weather does cooperate, there's no reason we couldn't hit this trend line yield. I do want to mention this area planted here at 39.255 million hectares. That number is likely inflated, and I can explain why in just a moment. And what we're looking at here, when you have your area planted and your yield, if you multiply that, that'll give you your production. So I talk about this area planted only to suggest that production will likely be a bit lower. Will it be record production? I think yes. I think before our record production was 384 million metric tons. So we have quite a bit of production that we can lose to still have a record crop year. It's just to say I don't think the market believes that we'll quite be this high, and I think a lot of it is due to this number, this area planted number, decreasing a little bit. Why? Futures prices are very, very low. So if we look at when COVID-19 started, and that was around here, February 20th is really when a lot of the turmoil happened in the markets. It's when everything really started to fall. So these are December corn futures. The December corn futures are what the farmer sells their new crop off of. So those December corn futures from February 20th down into May have fallen considerably. And right here you can see a 100-day moving average, and then you can see a 200-day moving average here in pink. And everything has fallen well below those moving averages. And that's to suggest that the farmer, since February 20th, has seen a significant dip in corn prices. On February 20th, which this data right here is good as of March 1st, we don't have any more recent data. It's the most recent data we have. So from February 20th, sort of late February, early March timeframe, we saw corn prices go down considerably. And if farmers maybe had not bought a lot of their inputs and had the ability to switch crops, maybe to cotton or to sorghum or to spring wheat in some of our northern states, they likely did. Now, how many hectares are we going to lose? It's really tough to say. We have another planning report coming out in June, but definitely, the market is very much anticipating a decrease in this number. It just remains how much that number will decrease, remains to be seen. So it has to do with just from when this data was last collected to where we are now, the significant dip in corn price. Furthermore, on the corn future side, I just want to bring this up. I do mention that U.S. corn is very cheap, and it is. Currently, in Argentine corn, obviously very cheap. Brazilian corn with harvest around the corner will be very cheap. But in the U.S., these low futures prices with no pressure to sell, they're pressure to sell, I guess, from an aspect of they don't need space. This corn is just sitting in their storage, and they are waiting for the right time to sell at a price that will make them profitable. So we still could see flat price out of the U.S. be fairly strong compared to Argentina and Brazil over the next couple of months. Strictly because Argentina has its harvest pressure, Brazil's is around the corner, and farmers in the U.S. have no incentive to sell until these futures prices can either bump up or they get offered some sort of a flat price in this region, which would keep U.S. flat price supported. That said, we are still, even if we don't have our 400 million ton harvest, I still think we're going to have a record harvest, and people will have to move grain. And that likely will come in the August-September timeframe. So August, September timeframe, do expect to see what I would call a fire sale out of the U.S. Lots of corn hitting the global market in preparation for new crops. So this year, because of some of the anticipated carryover, sort of the harvest pressure in the U.S. may actually be before the harvest and then extend through into the wintertime as the U.S. crop comes off. So I want to be very clear on that. We do have a lot of stocks that are sort of being held hostage. And when they do hit the market, again, right before harvest, we will see that harvest pressure come here in the U.S. and lower flat prices. Quickly, I don't want to go too much into this just because I know my friends from Poet will probably touch on this, but the U.S. ethanol industry, due to COVID-19, has taken a significant hit. They're on their way back, and I'll show you where they are today. But this was from April 10th, and then it got even worse down toward April 23rd. We hit some very, very low levels on ethanol production. And the big reason is because in the United States, we have a fuel mandate where we have to include 10% ethanol or have credits. And that really, the lack of fuel demand really caused, oil prices to tank and ethanol profitability to be in question. And, during the quarantine phase when everybody was in their house and still are, there was a lot of concern about the future of the ethanol industry. But I think now that people are starting to move around a little bit, travel a little bit more, I think the industry is less concerned just because right here you can look at ethanol production. We've had a significant bounce back from April 24th at 537,000 barrels per day to May 22nd, which is our most recent data at 724,000 barrels per day. So production levels are on the rise. They're on their way back. Again, I think friends from Poet can definitely talk more about what that means for the industry. But I can tell you what it means for corn prices, and that's important to note. Corn prices really fell out during the COVID crisis. So for those of you that are buyers, I find this graph to be fascinating. That every year you have seasonal harvest pressure in the U.S. sort of around harvest time, which is your September to December timeframe. You see some of the lower prices, and then your higher prices you see sort of at the end of the crop cycle, which is going to be your April through July, when we're playing in what we call a weather market. But this year, because of a perceived lack of demand for corn in the ethanol sector, and quickly, ethanol cannot be understated, its impact on corn price. it takes up 40% of U.S. corn crop annually. So it is a massive demand center for U.S. corn. So if you're wondering why I'm harping on it so much when I'm talking about corn prices, it's because 40% of our corn will go there, and any kind of serious demand destruction in the ethanol sector could be devastating for corn prices. So back to the graph, when we look at the ethanol demand falling out here in between late February, early March, we see prices go way down for corn, whereas traditionally this should be the time of year when prices are the highest. So I think this graph illustrates very well the black swan event that is COVID-19. And, I think it tells buyers that this year is very atypical. And right now, even though in the past you may not have evaluated U.S. origin during this time frame, strictly because Argentina is always the cheaper option, I would suggest that may not be the case this year. Certainly continue to evaluate U.S. even as pressure comes to the Brazilian and Argentinian crop. There's going to be, I think, quite a bit of opportunity for U.S. to sneak in there. And then obviously when the U.S. crop comes off and we have that also the fire sale in August set, I think the U.S. will certainly be the world's cheapest origin, and we will likely at that point see some of the cheapest grain of the year. Showed you this graph here, but again, ethanol industry back on the rise. Just want to, I'll let Poet touch on that a bit more. Back to this graph, this global corn estimate and the U.S. ending stocks of 84 million tons. Even if that does go down a little bit because we do see more demand in ethanol, which I think we likely will, we'll likely see a smaller crop out of the U.S. than is projected today. So this 84 million ton number should shrink along with our world ending stocks. But that's still to say that we will have record ending stocks in the U.S. I mean, we will have a huge stockpile of corn, which means that even though globally, we have seen more corn in the balance sheet, having this huge stockpile of corn means that the U.S. specifically will be a very cheap origin, at least for the next year or two to come, with hopefully export demand, doing what markets do, finding homes for cheap grain, and export demand taking up some of this extra surplus of corn. So when I look at commodity prices, I'm going to wrap up with this and then briefly discuss corn gluten meal. What's bullish corn? We've got difficult planting in certain spots, but there will be some prevent plant, I think, that we'll lose up in the North Dakota region just because of soil saturation makes it difficult to get out there. And then also we'll likely see a decrease just in general due to some of the corn prices going down. So that should try to help regulate corn prices a little bit, give them a little bit of support. Also, I mentioned ethanol plants coming back online should try to support corn futures a little bit. And then farmer selling on the flat price side will remain slow until they need to make space. We've got government provided funds in their pocket, as well as just no incentive to sell whatsoever due to low prices. So they'll wait until the very last minute to sell that. And again, when they do, hopefully as buyers, you can be very opportunistic and get in there. What's bearish? Crop is 88% planted. We're well ahead of schedule when it comes to planting and emergence. And then also there's U.S.-China trade and COVID-19 tension, which is bad for any market, whether you're talking equities, commodities, just global trade in general will cease or will be impacted severely should there be any kind of blow up between the U.S. and China. And then another bearish indicator for corn, as I mentioned earlier, the weak Brazilian real, Argentinian peso, and Ukrainian hryvnia will continue to encourage more acres, which will continue to lead to larger global stockpiles. Quickly on corn gluten meal, I want to look at April 23rd. So April 23rd was kind of the date when we saw the ethanol industry at its bottom and a lot of uncertainty, I think, in all corn co-products around the world. So for those of you that may be on April 23rd or sort of right in the heart of the COVID quarantine here in the United States, we're seeing very, very high prices of over $600 FOB. Perhaps you were seeing it closer to the $700 range by the time it got to your feed mill. I would encourage you to reevaluate. I mean, we've seen prices go down by almost 20% over the past month. So the price has gone down considerably. We saw a lot of short covering, people getting nervous about corn gluten meal supply, but I think a lot of that is being quelled. It's same with the DDG side, which again, we'll talk about, but a lot of the supply concerns are being quelled, and we're seeing pricing return to some sort of normalcy. And now I think rather than people covering short side or anything like that, we can count on corn gluten meal, fluctuating and running with corn and soybean meal and protein values as it normally does. So I think barring a second wave of COVID-19 that would cause corn co-products to come into question again, we're probably back to sort of a state of quote unquote normalcy when it comes to corn gluten meal pricing and trends and tendencies to fluctuate with corn and protein prices. That's all I have today. I know I went a little bit over time, but a lot of this information is very essential, and I want you all to have it. Please do continue to evaluate U.S. origin for your corn purchases. Let us know where we can help. We can provide support in any way, shape, or form. I work very closely with Alejandra and Amit. So anything that you all need, please let them know, let me know. We are here for you. We're here to support you during these difficult times, as well as be your preferred provider for feed grains. So with that, I'll stop sharing. I'll take any questions later, and I really appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Reese. That was really good information. And certainly we've already had 4 questions posted, but we will get to those during the Q&A live session. I'd like to open the floor for Dr. Kevin Herrick, who is the Technical Services Director for POET, and Andrew Greggs, who's the Export Merchandiser for POET as well. And they'll walk us through the DDG PS&D and some nutritional information as well. So take it away, Dr. Herrick and Andrew.
Thank you, Alejandra. Amit, Reese, Kurt, Kyle, thanks for having us, all of you out there. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you joining us this morning for us, this evening for you. And we're here, Kevin and I are here to just kind of give you a little update, tell you a little bit about POET for those of you not familiar. So we'll jump right into it. Make sure I can share my screen here. Oh, hold on a sec here. All right. There we go. So just a little overview of POET. So POET started by Jeff Broyne back in 1987 on their family farm in Wanamingo, Minnesota. So we started as, basically as an experiment from the standpoint of ethanol or a biorefining company. Basically, they had an old fermenter they used on their farm. They were experimenting with it and basically learned how to make ethanol. And from that, from one fermenter on a local farm, we've grown into the largest ethanol and DDG producer in the world. So just first slide showing a little bit of stats on POET. We have 28 plants in 7 different states, over 1,800 team members, and then kind of just shows some of the revenue, some of the growth we've had, as well as our overall production. Like I said, so we have 28 plants, 28 biorefineries in 7 different states, so scattered between 20 plants in the west of the Mississippi River and 8 plants in the east, between South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. So I kind of show you this map, and we'll lead into it on the next one of POET's plants. So all of POET's biorefineries were all built by POET. So all 28 plants are all built exactly the same. It's very interesting. You go to Google Maps and you look at, say, Mitchell, South Dakota versus Alexandria, Indiana. They're going to look almost exactly the same. They're all built by PD&C with BPX production. There's no Vogelbush, no ICM. It's all POET plants, which I always point out because when you look at from a DDG standpoint, one of the issues that comes up with DDGs is the consistency of DDGs. The color, the protein, the fat, the different specifications. With what we do, and I think with other like ICM plants as well, you get a very, very consistent product because all the plants were built exactly the same. They're all built by POET. So this just kind of gives you an overview, and on the bottom it lists where our different locations are. This is an overview or map of the U.S. Ethanol production or U.S. ethanol industry. So the red dots are all ethanol facilities or biorefining facilities. I think there's just around 214, that's what it is. As of 2016, I think now it's around 220, 230 different ethanol or biorefineries in the U.S. What we kind of point out with here is when when different ethanol or biorefining companies are building plants, they like to build them around the input, the corn. So the green shaded areas is the U.S. Corn Belt. That's where most of the corn is grown in the U.S., across Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Indiana, the Dakotas, and Nebraska. And when you look at the ethanol industry, a lot of it's built around that corn. You lead with the seed. We build for efficiency so that we use we build around the inputs and then move the revenue streams to where they want to go. This kind of gives you a little update of just what the structure of the ethanol industry looks like to an extent. And also kind of gives you an idea of what the production looks like as well. There's 90% of the ethanol industry is dry mill versus 10% wet mill, meaning 90% makes DDGS or dry distiller grains versus the other 10% makes different commodities, or basically essentially just wet feed essentially that's not as dry. And then it kind of, what else do we got here? I have to move this so I can see. And that kind of shows you the different types, dry distiller grains with solubles, wet distiller grains, modified distiller grains, which is around a 50% moisture, and then condensed solubles. And a lot of those wet and modified distiller grains are used more for local production. It's very tough to export it, obviously, because it's too wet. It molds, or it goes bad very, very quickly, within a few weeks. So a lot of that goes for local cattle production is a lot of where that wet feed goes. This just kind of gives you a scope of the POET as well as the U.S. ethanol, DDGS, or biorefining industry. So POET makes up about 12 to 13% of the U.S. Ethanol biorefining industry. So of the corn ground, as Reese mentioned earlier, 40% of the U.S. corn crop is used for ethanol production. So it's a huge, huge number, a huge demand factor from the U.S. corn standpoint. We'll kind of get into that a little bit later on, like Reese said, what the ethanol industry is doing, how that's affecting corn, and how that's affecting supply and demand on those areas as well. But overall for POET, 16 million metric ton of, we grind 16 million metric ton of corn per year out of the U.S. Total ethanol industry is about 120 million metric ton of corn ground for ethanol. POET produces about 6.8 billion liters of ethanol. Of the 60 billion liters of ethanol produced per year in the U.S., we make 4.6 million metric ton of DDGS versus just under 40 million metric ton of DDGS made in the U.S. every year, or in 2018 at least, and it's pretty consistent through the last couple of years. And then we also make 236 million kilograms of oil versus 1.44 billion kilograms of oil made in the U.S. So when you hear POET, we always want to talk about what differentiates us and why we are different from the industry. So kind of go into that. And this is really the nuts and bolts of POET. It's from a DDG standpoint, at least, of how we differentiate ourselves. We always say we're a non-commodity playing in a commodity market. So first thing to kind of explain it, I want to go over the standard ethanol process versus our what we call BPX process. So in the standard ethanol process, you have corn being ground or brought into the biorefinery. It's ground up in a hammer mill. So basically it's just ground fine, so it's easier to extract the starch. It's mixed with water. Now, after it's done this what we call slurry, so it's the ground corn mixed with water, it goes into what's called a jet cooker. And the reason in a normal production process they use a jet cooker is because you kind of think of like microwave popcorn. It makes it much easier to extract the starch. It almost kind of pops out. So when you heat the starch molecules, essentially it heats it and it just creates that movement. And so I shouldn't say that. It heats it so that it's more easily extractable by those enzymes to take that starch away from that corn essentially. So that jet cooker a lot of times will heat that slurry or that corn mash, if you will, to upwards of around 100 degrees Celsius, and a lot of times for anywhere from 45 minutes to a few hours, so that it's much easier to extract that starch. That's very, very good for the ethanol production process, but for the DDG production process, that's not so good because essentially heating of that corn mash or that current slurry can cause what we call Maillard effect, which is essentially binding of the fat, fiber, and protein molecules. So essentially, that's where you used to get, like, especially when DDGS were first being produced back in the 80s and 90s, that's where you get those kind of that burnt. So there's part of it would get kind of that burnt mentality, the darker color. From in the old days, from the jet cooker and also from the dryer, which we'll get into in a little bit. But essentially, you have those binding, which can cause damage to the nutrients in the feed, essentially. So after that, you go into fermentation, and then you go into, after fermentation, which is usually around 70 to 80 hours. That's when you go into distillation, and you really do your separation of your ethanol from what we call our whole stillage, which is just ethanol, and then the rest is what we make DDGs and water. Essentially, it would be the distillers mixed with water. So and the oil as well. So after whole stillage, you go into a centrifuge. This is where you separate essentially your wet grain, which is kind of your grain water, with your solubles, your syrup, or your sugars. And then as well as your oil. After the centrifuge, which is separating the solubles or from the wet grain, the solubles will then go into another centrifuge where you're actually extracting that corn oil. So you're separating those sugars from the corn oil, and that's how we get corn oil. The wet grain will go into, usually in typical production process, a drum dryer. When you think of a drum dryer, you think of just like your normal, think of a clothes dryer, just a big circular drum that turns it, flips it over, and heats it. And we do actually put some solubles, these sugars, back onto the drum dryer. A lot of times, with any ethanol process, any industry, a lot of times this is how these days, how these darker DDGs are created. So when we talk about color, there's always an issue with color. Now, as I said earlier, back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, when it was more about the ethanol production process and DDGS were a byproduct. No one really cared about them. They just wanted to sell the ethanol and get the DDGs out. Today, DDGs are considered more of a co-product. So back in the day, that's why you had darker burnt DDGs, because they weren't as worried about the quality of the DDGs. Today, it's very, very different. So the quality of the DDGs is much better because it's much bigger piece of the margin structure for plants. So there is much more focus on creating quality DDGs that aren't burnt. But you still see at times DDGs that are dark. This is not because these DDGs typically are burnt. It's typically because you have additional solubles added to those DDGs. So those solubles aren't necessarily a bad thing. It's extra sugars essentially added to the DDGs, or extra energy. We always kind of like to say, if you're above 42, 43 color, it's probably just additional solubles rather than a glucose issue or some other production issue that's causing the darker color. So kind of a side note there on color, but going back to it from a normal process, and we could talk about the difference here too, the drum dryer versus what we use. Typically the solubles are put back on the wet grain, and then it's all dried, and you have your DDGs. So now going into Poet's process, you can kind of see where we're going to highlight the differences. In Poet's process, a lot of it's very similar, but there's a couple big pieces that are very different. So typically you have your corn, yeast and enzymes usually in fermentation. Going into the same thing, you're in a hammer mill, you're grinding up the corn, you're adding water in the slurry tank. And this is where we have a big difference between Poet and non-Poet. So essentially, Poet, what we have is called the BPX cold cook process. So in the previous slide, you could see the jet cooker where it's heating the DDGs with corn mash, or heating the corn mash up to 100, 105 degrees Celsius. Poet, we don't heat those. We don't use a jet cooker. We don't heat those DDGs. We use what's called the BPX cold cook process. So essentially, we are using a different combination, an identity preserved combination of yeast and enzymes to extract that starch. So we don't need that heat to basically make the popcorn mentality, if you will, or that starch popping out. We use the different combination of yeast and enzymes, which allows for better preservation of the nutrients in the feed. So you get much higher digestibility versus the using a jet cooker, where if you're heating the feed, you're binding the fat, fiber, and protein molecules. With BPX, you're not doing that. You're not creating that binding of those different nutrients. So it's much easier for the animal to digest it, which typically creates higher digestibility, or always creates higher digestibility for Poet DDGs versus commodity DDGs, which are using jet cookers. So as I mentioned, we use the BPX process, then kind of goes back to the similar production process through fermentation, distillation, where you're getting ethanol. You have whole stillage into that centrifuge where you're getting you're removing the syrup from the wet grain, and in the syrup piece, it's very similar. You're just same thing, same centrifuge that is separating the corn oil from the solubles. With the wet grain, we have a little difference here as well. We mentioned before the drum dryer, which is essentially just a big circular drum that rotates and dries the DDGs. And just like a clothes dryer, when you think of your clothes dryer, you think of a clothes dryer like that's touching your clothes constantly and it's flipping them. So it's constantly in contact with the hot surface within the dryer. So that can also create some of that, essentially DDGs being burnt and the quality issues. With Poet and with other plants, a lot of other plants are adopting the ring dryer in the US. The ring dryer is essentially a forced air dryer, where it's essentially a forced air system. So in a typical drum dryer, you're in the DDGs are on the drum dryer for spinning for 45 minutes or so, and that's heating to, again, close to 100 degrees Celsius. The ring dryer has the same temperatures, but you're only in that ring dryer for about 2 minutes. With the Maillard reaction, you need to be in, typically they say, anywhere from 5 to 6 minutes of over 100, 105 degrees Celsius to have that Maillard reaction, have that quality disruption in the feed. So that ring dryer, essentially, it's keeping it at a very, very short time frame, and you also don't have the touching of the DDGs to the side of the dryer, which is causing some of those little black flakes you'll see once in a while. It's essentially all just forced air, forcing the DDGs up and blowing them essentially as you go over the ring. As the DDGs get dry enough, they essentially go over top the ring and down. As they're still not dry, they kind of just sit and wait, get dried, and then as they get dry enough, it only takes typically about 2 minutes, they go over the top and down and out. And that's the big difference. You're not having that contact with the dryer, as well as a much shorter time frame that you're in the dryer. So with Poet, you look at the two main differences, I would say, well, I should say into a couple main differences. The two bigger differences in our process of, the mechanical process is our BPX cold cut treatment and our ring dryers. But as mentioned too, there's a lot of plants, a lot of facilities in the US that are switching to ring dryers. It's not just Poet using these. And then one thing we always mention too is, from a quality standpoint, our lab testing, we're testing corn in for mycotoxins, very strict on mycotoxin testing. We increase testing during harvest. So when new crop comes in, we know what we're getting. We do surveys for different areas. If we see high mycotoxins from one area, we're going to try and buy corn from different areas to keep those mycotoxin levels down. One thing we do as well is we use segregation. So we have a silo storage or upright storage, and we have our grains building, which is we call our floor flat storage. So what we have this for is essentially the separation of when we have low quality DDGs. So if we have any DDGs that are out of spec that are lower fat, lower in protein, lower in color, high glucose, anything like that, we're separating those from our Dakota Gold. So we sell our Dakota Gold, which is what we try to produce, but you ask any other ethanol producer, they're not going to produce perfect DDGs 100% of the time. So if we do have production issues, we have high glucose DDGs, we are able to segregate that to our flat storage and sell those off-spec DDGs to typically local markets. So when you're contracting with Poet and you contract Dakota Gold, between our 27 different facilities and our segregation of the commodities, essentially, or the quality, segregation of quality, you're always getting that Dakota Gold. So we always have multiple locations with that segregated commodity or with Dakota Gold on hand to ship you. So that is one thing that we're doing as well, is keeping that segregation piece, segregating the DDGs from the Dakota Gold so that you're getting high quality DDGs. So we talk about segregation, the BPX process, different lab testing, and then our ring dryer as well. So I will turn it over to Dr. Kevin Herrick, and then I'll kind of pick it up with some more market eval at the end too, but take it away, Dr. Herrick.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. I think I just requested, yep, there we go. So I can hopefully advance through my slides, but thanks again for having us speak today. Just wanted to touch base on kind of more on the nutritional side. So, and really, maybe have three perceptions of DDGs that we really want to challenge. So, this first one is looking at the value. Now, especially recently, we've heard a lot about value to corn, and with as Reese kind of mentioned, with the challenges with COVID, and we saw a significant increase in the value to corn for DDGs. Well, from a nutrition standpoint, what I really want to really kind of highlight is that value really doesn't have much significance, and it doesn't describe the nutritional value. And the best way I think to kind of highlight this is to ask yourself, well, if we have 3 times the fiber, minerals, protein, etc. to corn, why are we comparing against just corn? And what is the real value of distillers grains of Dakota Gold? And it's something that I think we have to do, just challenge ourselves. And the question we ask then too is, well, why do we still calculate, or why do we still use value to corn? And very simply, it's easy. We can do that calculation in our head most of the time. And then there's also the tradition and the benchmark, and there is some value from that standpoint. It's just seeing where distillers grains was priced. But from a nutrition standpoint, that's one thing that I'd like to lead with, is that really it doesn't tell us as much as what we were really would hope it would. Oops, let's see here if I can use a slideshow here. So, one of the ways that we can kind of look at this, and this is just an example of, instead of using a value to corn, is actually going and calculating the value of those nutrients. And this little table that I put together shows how that if we did something similar to like a Dakota Gold value to corn or soybean meal, how that percentage. But if we look at all these nutrients that distillers grains brings, so net energy for gain, metabolizable energy, cost per unit of the protein, and then also the dry matter, you can see that each ingredient really has a lot of differences as far as value in a diet. Some ingredients are really good buys all the time for all nutrients, and some are maybe have some different nutrients that they provide a little bit more value. So we won't go into the details of all this, but bottom line is it's looking at more than just value to corn really does have it does give a better picture of the nutritional value for DDGs. So the next thing that we really kind of want to look at is this whole energy content or energy perception for when we talk about value. And the industry has really started to move towards more and more of the oil extraction, and as a result, we're seeing distillers grains with less and less oil content. And unfortunately, the perception in the industry is that as we take out the oil, that we're taking out the energy. And to some extent, that is true, because we do remove oil is a prime energy component. So if we remove oil, we're obviously removing energy. But the thing to remember is that isn't the only part of this whole picture, that there are a lot of other factors that go into the energy of distillers grains. And really from how much it contributes to the total energy, the oil content really doesn't make that much of a difference. And I love to show this little comparison, because this really kind of drives home the point of these differences in energy. So what we'll see here on the left-hand side is a graph that shows the gross energy. And each of the green little dots represents different distillers grains with a different fat content. And the fat content is on this x-axis. And if we take a look at gross energy, and the gross energy is just the energy that's in that product. So it may or may not be available to the animal, but every ingredient has gross energy, and it's just kind of a measure basically of what's in that product. As you can see, as the DDGs have more and more fat, that gross energy increases, and it's a really linear relationship. We have that nice, strong linear relationship. But now let's take a look at those same distillers grains, and now instead of looking at gross energy, let's look at parent metabolizable energy for nitrogen corrected. So more of a poultry measure of the energy that's actually available to the animal or to the bird. And as you can see here, when we do this, now we don't see that relationship. Now we see more of a shotgun pattern, and there's very little relationship. And even some of these DDGs that had really low oil actually have some of the highest energy values. So the bottom line, or the takeaway from this comparison, is that number one, not all DDGs are the same, but number two is that really fat although it is important and we should look at it from a nutrition standpoint, may not be the best indicator for total energy or total value to the bird or to the animal, that is. So related to that, but we still need the energy requirement when we're formulating diets. And there's a lot of published equations out there that really kind of try to estimate what the distillers grains brings to a diet. Unfortunately, a lot of those energy equations do a horrible job of actually predicting the energy. And if we look at these three lines represent the three published equations showing, okay, well, what was the predicted versus actual? As you can see, they all underestimate the actual energy value of the distillers grains that were tested in this process. And one of the reasons that we feel that this is the case is that because we have differences in processes with distillers grains, just like Andrew mentioned, that really affect the quality of the distillers grains, that it's very, very, very difficult to have one energy equation to adjust for all those different variables for companies. So what we're looking at more is creating unique energy equations based on process. And now this is going to be a more precise equation that we'll be able to have more confidence, but it'll be less robust or less dynamic. So we won't be able to use it across all DDGs, but it will provide more value from a nutritional standpoint. So, really kind of the takeaway, it's more than just evaluating that fat. And there's differences in processes, and we really can't treat all DDGs the same. So those are some of the kind of the key takeaways from that comment. Just a final comment or final little section, and Andrew really did a nice job of just highlighting some of this, but the other perception to challenge is this color. Now, we definitely recognize the relevance and the market perception. But here too, similar to value to corn, there's very little relationship between the color of distillers grains and the nutritional value. And, the question is, well, why do we still evaluate? And, similar to value to corn, it's easy. You can actually pick up a handful of distillers grains. You can take a look at it. And then you can also run it through to the hunter score and get those. So it's easy to get that. And the other reason why we do it is because there's really a lack of other ways to measure. But as Andrew mentioned, there's a lot of things that we can kind of look at that maybe contribute to it. Unfortunately, if we look at the amino acid digestibility, so one of those things that we perceive that if a darker DDGs actually has poor digestibility, we really don't see that there's many indications. So what this really looked at was looking at actual amino acid digestibility, and then looking at different measures for crude protein, insoluble crude protein for the fiber, and then pepsin digestibility and color. And really, nothing really had a good correlation to really predict that actual amino acid digestibility. Pepsin digestibility maybe had the best, but really there isn't that good indicator that kind of measures the amino acid digestibility. Andrew mentioned that there's a lot of things that really affect the color. One of the interesting things that we looked at was even year really affects the color. And so different years have different colors, and then as we go through the season, it seems like color also tends to decline as well as we continue on, or as we go into months of harvest storage. So the color, really, it's a debatable measure of quality. Causes poor drying, and as Andrew mentioned, really that was an issue more in the early days when there wasn't as much focus on quality. Residual glucose and then excessive solubles are probably the two biggest things that we see now that really affect the color and get it dark. And generally speaking, if we see a DDG less than 40, that's probably more of an indication of overheating. But above that, there's probably other issues that are really contributing to the darker color. And we're really working hard to educate the industry just to kind of challenge this perception and all those other perceptions. So. With that, I'll turn it back over to Andrew.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'll kind of finish with some market updates and go back. There we go. Kind of just a overall perspective of POET from an export standpoint, from an international standpoint, and kind of what we do, what our footprint looks like, and then kind of give you some market perspectives of what kind of has happened. As Reese touched on, there's a lot that's happened over the last few months, and kind of how that's affected the DDG industry and how the ethanol industry and that demand affects the DDG industry. So overall, POET DDG sales, this is 2018 data. 2019 is going to be a little different, but domestically, it's still about the same. 74% of our DDGs are sold domestically. We sell about 10% North American export, and I would say 9.9% of that is going to Mexico. Probably closer to 8% now is in containerized exports, another 8% in bulk exports. We have really grown, and I would say probably it's switched 9% container versus 7% bulk. We've really grown our container exports over the last few years. Typically we export probably around 30 to 35,000 metric ton per month in containers. So becoming a big player in the export industry. And as you can see from the map below, we have quite a few locations. I think we're in right now, we're in close to 30 different countries that we're exporting to. We've exported to over 40 different countries. So quite a few locations for export. On the right, it kind of shows an update of where the total DDGS, or I should say distiller, this includes wet DDGs, or wet distillers, where the total distiller market, kind of what makes up the total distiller demand from the US. 25% is export, 4% is poultry, 5.4% is swine, 25.4% is dairy, and 40.2% is beef. Now, the way it looks is beef and dairy are pretty big. That's not going to be that relevant or that big from a dry distiller standpoint. I would say 95 to 99%, or quite closer to 99% of the wet distillers produced in the US are going to beef and dairy. And as the graph we showed before, that's a significant percentage of the distillers grown in the US. And then the map below kind of shows a animal density by area of where these, the higher demand areas are in the US. So, you look at the center, north center US, where Iowa, Nebraska, Iowa, that's a lot of, or southern Minnesota, it's a lot of swine demand. In the western US, California, Idaho, or Oregon, Washington, that's more dairy. And then, Texas, Nebraska, you've got more beef demand. And then in the southeast, in the Carolinas, you've got a lot of the poultry demand, and Florida as well. Let's see, get this out of the way again. So this just a quick map of, the green dots are the plants relative to all the different locations that we export to. All the yellow dots are the containerized exports, and then the blue dot is New Orleans, Louisiana. That's for bulk exports. So what we typically do, like I mentioned, we do both bulk and containers. So containerized exports, we sell CFR, for a lot of locations, or a lot going to South Asia, Southeast Asia. So we do everything ourselves. We manage the freight. We do all that. We manage the transloading. We do all that. So from a containerized export standpoint, we sell CFR. From a bulk standpoint, we typically, what we do is we do sell bulk, but typically we work with different companies like ADM or Bunge or TR, the rice company, or Cargill, or different companies like that, to load vessels in New Orleans with our barges. We will sell our barges delivered New Orleans, loaded vessel, or excuse me, they'll load the vessel for us, and essentially they're dealing with the end user, or selling direct to the end user customer. But typically the way we do it, we sell a lot to Ireland, and we deal direct with the customers in Ireland, Israel as well, and we deal direct to some of the customers in Turkey. So we sell a lot of bulk. It's a lot of bulk combo. But the way we do it is we kind of usually have that intermediary to help kind of navigate and from a bulk standpoint, a bulk vessel standpoint, help with shipment. We don't at this time have any assets in the Gulf, so working with these bigger companies to create these combo boats for them is very good. But typically we do deal direct with the end user. We kind of just match everything up through that third party, that Cargill or whoever we're working with. To get you those DDGs from a bulk standpoint. So there's always the optionality from container standpoint, which is all us. We do very easily. We've done very well. We've been doing it for the past or multiple years, and as well as bulk export standpoint. Whether you're looking for one hold or a full vessel. We've chartered full vessels before by ourselves, but typically we don't buy or sell any other commodities than DDGs. We can, but not from a bulk standpoint. So that's where we work with those third parties, those larger companies, to get our DDGs on their vessel and then sell to the end user. from a market standpoint, I don't have a slide on this, but from a market standpoint, Reese kind of touched on it. What's happened? The big player that's gone on is COVID. As COVID crept into the U.S. in February and early March, we really saw driving demand take a hit. So as driving demand gets hit, you see ethanol supply go down, and ethanol demand goes down, ethanol supply goes down, which means DDGS supply went down. So in March, we really saw prices spike because we had a certain amount of forward contracts on, as everyone does. The industry did, I should say, and all of a sudden your supply was being cut in half, or at one point less than half, because of the reduced ethanol demand. Ethanol is in the DDGS ethanol industry. Ethanol is the driver. So ethanol kind of determines where that production level is, and DDGs kind of floats with it. So if you have a significant decrease in ethanol demand, as we did, you're going to have a significant decrease in DDGS supply, and obviously ethanol supply. So that's where prices, spiked. We had, I think it was Ethanol was at 1.240 per short ton. So it's I want to say that 265 per metric ton, somewhere in there. Sifnola, maybe 275 loaded vessel. At one point, it was very, very expensive. For a Chittagong standpoint, it was over $300 CFR Chittagong, just because the supply was reduced so much. Now that was March, April. Now we're kind of seeing the turnaround, as Reese mentioned. As you can see, I'm here in the office. Things are opening up in the U.S. Driving demand is starting to pick up, so supply has been increasing. So we're no longer at half rate or half run rates. We're seeing supply, increase over the last month or so. Now we're kind of getting to a point where it's starting to equalize, or we're starting to see a level off of supply. But that's why we've seen prices drop over the last month or so significantly, because you had this huge decrease in supply. Then all of a sudden supply came back as driving demand came back. So from the ethanol standpoint, you're definitely seeing more demand, which is good, which is therefore putting supply back into the industry from a DDGS standpoint. And we're kind of normalizing, getting back to typical June, close to, I would say, not typical, but closer to typical June pricing. So if you're looking like Chittagong, you're around probably between 255 and 260 CFR Chittagong. But that kind of gives you a market update of what has happened in the industry, I guess. And we'll wait for questions till the end, but we, again, appreciate your time. That's all we had for today. Thank you again for coming, for joining.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Dr. Herrick. That was really good information. If quickly, I know that we're a little bit over time, so I want to give the opportunity to get to some of the questions. Let me read the first one. When Brazil produces lower quantity of corn in the U.S., how come Brazil dominates world chicken markets through exports over the U.S. exports? I think that might be a Reese question.
Yeah, let me pull this up. I've got a really good graph that can illustrate that actually is probably not the case. Now that may be the case certain times of the year, and it also may be the case in your region, but I think globally that's not the case. I'm gonna briefly pull something up here, Alejandra, just to show global corn exports here very quickly. So right here we're looking at world corn exporters. So when you look at the main corn exporters around the world, the U.S. Projected to have 55 million tons of exports versus Brazil's 38 million. So Brazil certainly exports a larger percentage of their crop. So it may seem, percentage-wise that they export quite a bit more, but as far as dominating global chicken markets, that's simply not the case, just because the U.S. does export quite a bit more corn than Brazil. One of the reasons Brazil's exports a considerable percentage more than the U.S. does of their corn crop is because they don't have a corn ethanol industry that's as developed as ours. So our corn ethanol takes quite a bit more of our corn stocks, whereas in Brazil, they do have some corn ethanol, but it's primarily sugarcane.
Perfect, thank you. Second question is, which country produces non-GM corn?
We certainly produce quite a bit of it. I think lots of countries do produce non-GM corn. You can definitely source that from the U.S. I think folks like to say that Ukraine is non-GM, but that's up for debate. I think depending on who you ask and where they're from, they may give you a different answer. But yields might suggest that it is perhaps GM, whereas others would maybe say the increasing yields are due to precision farming and other new techniques that have just gotten to Ukraine that have been in the U.S. for some time. So, as far as GM corn, I think you can find that in most countries. I would say the most plentiful supplies would be in Ukraine and the U.S.
Thank you. Next question. How and what technology is used for such accurate data collection by the week in the U.S.? I think this is pertaining to how are we able to tell on a week-by-week basis acreage planted, corn emergence, and condition of the corn crop?
Yeah, so it's not technology as much as it is data collection and just being organized. So the USDA, in the U.S., we have states, and then within the states we have counties, and in those counties there are what we call extension agents, or people who work for the USDA that work for the AMS, the Agricultural Marketing Service. They exist in every county, and so those people on a county level are required to survey and call farmers and go out and look at fields and report back to Washington, D.C., which is where the USDA's headquarters are. And then from there, all of that data is aggregated. So it's not technology as much as it's just a very large group of people that go out and do some very thorough data collection.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what strategies is the U.S. government and the U.S. Grain Council adopting to convince countries that are blocking U.S. corn entry, saying due to U.S. being GM corn? If you like, I can take a shot at this one.
Sure.
So specifically for South Asia region, India is predominantly, has limitations on U.S. corn due to the GM origin, as well as DDGS. Our colleagues from POET can also attest to the fact that for several years we have been working within Indian industry and providing information not only on the nutritional side, but also on the fact that DDGS is a non-LMO or non-living modified organism. And so that's been one of the most advocacy we have done, is working through the Indian industry, whether it's CLIFMA or individual industries within the country, to try to create awareness of the origins of DDGS, the process of DDGS. And I think that we've touched on how DDGS is considered a safe product to be consumed. We've also provided information on similar countries using DDGS in their feed rations for their feed purposes, to some degree of acceptance in the Indian government and certainly within the Indian industry. I don't know if Dr. Herrick or Andrew have any comments on that side.
No, I think that was well said.
So next question is, are corn imports in containers into the Gulf, like the UAE and Oman, possible directly by the end users? And how can we get U.S. grain support to see this flow happen?
Possible, yes. Likely, no. There's so many reasons that large agribusiness exists. First I'll answer that. How do we get this to happen, and how do you have our support? Reach out to Ahmed and Alejandra and just let them know exactly what you're trying to do, and we can discuss it. I don't, as far as the prospects of that is something that is way down the road. So as far as direct contact with growers and trying to get corn, sourced directly from the field, that's not in the near future. Is it going to happen, and are people pushing for that as uniformity of information becomes, more Catholic around the world? Then it's very likely that happens. But as far as something today, I really don't see that. I think blockchain technology can change that. One of the really big things that agribusinesses do is they provide a credit risk for the grower. So if if a grower wants to sell directly to particularly a new market like a UAE, where we really don't trade a whole lot of corn, or in Oman, where again, don't trade a whole lot of corn year in, year out, credit is going to be an issue, or not necessarily an issue, but something that's going to come up. And I know Andrew and Kevin certainly know that feeling of trying to develop a new market and having to talk about credit, et cetera. And when you're a grower and don't have as much money in your pocket to absorb some sort of a loss, you're not as positioned to do that. And that's where, big agribusiness, like a Poet or a Cargill or these large players are able to provide some sort of a service. So could it happen? Yes. Are we behind it? I mean, I think that the industry is moving that direction. So I think it would be foolish to not try to help guide it in some way, shape, or form. But I really think that is so far down the line. I don't want to burst your bubble, but I really think it's so far down the line that looking at it today is looking at it as a viable option today is probably not reasonable.
I think one thing too is, just to comment quick on that, is also you mentioned the credit risk. It takes a significant amount of investment to do that, to go from farmer direct to CFR to location, because like with I've been mentioned, we don't have assets in the Gulf from a bulk standpoint. We use multiple transloads for containers, but our company is 1,800 people, and we're still always debating, okay, do we want to make this investment versus you have one farmer and you talk about containers, which is different than bulk, obviously. If you have one farmer who's got to make a significant investment, or the international company has to make a significant investment in the U.S. to create those pieces and put those logistics together to try and get farmer direct to international or to your company. So those, like Reese said, those big agribusinesses play a very big role, not only in credit risk, but also providing those logistical services to get those containers, those bulk vessels there, anything things like that. So,
Andrew, just quickly, I mean, on this topic, I mean, do you see it moving that way? I mean, I think we're moving that way, but like you said, I mean, that's going to require a lot of money in very few hands for something like that. But what do you see in the future? Yeah,
I think so. I think farmer direct, and I look at it from a standpoint of just a big agribusiness here. It used to be the bigger agribusinesses like ADM, Bunge, Cargill. They would deal with a lot of the elevators or the transloading companies, the commercials that we call them elevators. Essentially, they're basically taking grain from the farmer and then moving it to, whether it's export, to production, wherever. Now, those companies, those bigger companies, are going direct to the farmer. So you're seeing at least that integration of more direct usage. And I think that will, in time too, create more direct usage between the farmer and different international companies or different countries direct. But as of, like you said, Reese, right now, it's just there's still so much to do to get that product moved from farmer to another country that you have to have. At this point, you have to have those facilitator companies, we'll call them, involved as well. So,
great point. It's a great point.
Thank you both. How much corn imports are you expecting to Bangladesh this year? How much from India and how much from other countries? And if I may, I would also ask, how much DDGS imports are you expecting to see into Bangladesh as well? Let's start with the corn.
But on the corn side, I may pass that to Amit. As far as Bangladesh specific, I'm not super certain as far as what their demand needs are today.
Okay, thanks, Reese, Kevin, Andrew. Thank you for giving a very nice presentations today. On Bangladesh, we're looking at Bangladesh. Demand destruction has happened in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is right now harvesting its own corn. We could still look at Bangladesh importing a sizable amount of corn, maybe to the tune of about 700,000 tons or more, even after the demand destruction, because the industry is coming back into action. DDGS last year imports were about 155,000 tons. Still feel that there is a possibility that more imports could take place as aqua sector, the poultry sector, the dairy sector continue to increase, and the prices, what Reese and Andrew you told about the pricing. If the pricing remains, I think it will be very competitive to use DDGS in poultry, dairy, and aqua rations coming in at $250 delivered. I think it's a it's a feasible option to increase it. And that number from 155 could go up to maybe about 200,000 tons for DDGS, and also corn gluten meal could be thrown in.
Thank you. Andrew, do you have any comments on the DDGS side?
No, I think Ahmet said it well. I mean, he's definitely going to know the end user demand and what that demand really looks like. You know, for us, at least I can speak to us, we've definitely seen an increase in exports over the last year and a half or so to Bangladesh. And I'm guessing a big part of that, you know, a year and a half, 2 years ago was due to the ban on meat and bone meal. So I think if that ban is still there, DDGs is a great protein replacement or great replacement for that. So we, you know, like you mentioned, you're definitely more aware of what's going on there, Amit, from a demand standpoint. But at least I can speak to that as long as that, you know, that ban is in place, and even after, if it gets resolved, I think the use of DDGs, you know, the customers we have that we talk to in Bangladesh, they like it, they like our product, they like DDGs in general. I think that move into Bangladesh will continue demand for DDGS.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. How is the production looking for U.S. grains, considering the growing demand along with COVID at hand? Are we seeing any trade hurdles due to that?
Repeat that. How is the production looking for U.S. grains?
Mm-hmm. Considering the growing demand along with COVID.
We're going to have a record crop as long as the weather cooperates. I think, you know, with the amount of area that's planted, even though we will decrease it, I stand by those comments, and I think the market does too. You know, as long as we don't have any kind of severe weather events, anything comparable to 2012, any kind of droughts like that, I think just the amount of planted acres or planted hectares that we have today is fairly insurmountable. So, you know, again, I want to go back. The U.S. is positioned to have very, very large ending stocks, and the export market seems like a really great place for a lot of that to go. You know, even in today's balance sheet, they're projecting 132 million metric tons of use in ethanol, which is up for the past year. So they're not even predicting ethanol demand to stay as low as it has been. So that they are certainly continuing to project that upward trend of improvement that we've seen. So really, you know, unless we can get some kind of maybe an increase, you know, if we can improve our relations with China and increase demand for pork exports to China or something like that. You know, right now we have record animals on feed, so it's not like you know, we're not scratching the ceiling when it comes to feed demand domestically as well. So I really see export markets to be a really, really crucial player to try to even out this balance sheet, and that means cheap prices. That means prices that are going to work in the export markets. That's what that means.
Great, thank you. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Dr. Herrick, Andrew, Reese, thank you very much for your presentations. To the participants, thank you for staying a little bit over, and to all of us as well. Just a last comment, you know, we are very optimistic for South Asia. We do see growing opportunities in the market, as much as COVID has caused severe damages, not only in this region, but across the globe. We do see we're not seeing the same levels of destruction and mortality in South Asia as a region as we're seeing in some other regions. And I think that's something that we should applaud and recognize for the South Asia region. But we're also seeing slow and gradual progress on demand construction and demand coming up in some industries. And we hope to be able to work with you, our customers in South Asia, as you're continuing to build your operations and continuing to grow your industries. With that, thank you very much. It was really great to see you all. Stay safe, stay well, and till next time.
Thank you.